and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. One of the most extraordinary sidebar stories of the 2024 election has been the complete implosion of mainstream media. Of course, mainstream news, or more exactly, legacy media, was in its death throes long before Trump won in November. The major network news, cable news, the newspapers of record, the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR radio, all had been bleeding viewers and listeners to varying degrees up and down for years. The rise of social media, and in particular podcasts, YouTube and TikTok, were becoming the go-to for news consumption, and that reached an apotheosis in the election. For sure, the cable news networks all had a bump during the pre-election days, with Fox News leading them all. But after they resumed the struggling path that most cable television has been on since viewers switched to streaming in droves, even Fox has never really regained its glory days. But that's only half the story. Americans not only lost their faith in news, but have seemingly recoiled against the ideological bias of the elite media in ways that have left institutions like the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, and others unmoored and left behind. Even more than their obvious preference for platforming liberal left politics, consumers are reacting to the disconnect of these organizations to the real lives and interests of people outside the wealthy bicoastal enclaves of the country. The yawning expanse of understanding between the wealthy and overeducated and the middle and working classes of the country found the former wrapped up in identity politics, while the latter struggled with the damage done by COVID lockdowns and inflation. When more than half the nation voted Trump into office again, the realization came like a punch in the face. Major news organizations like CNN, the Washington Post, and NBC, bastions of the liberal center left, started laying off workers and scrambling to adjust editorially. Moreover, Trump is determined to sideline them in traditional roles in Washington now too, squeezing them out of studio and desk space at the Pentagon and opening up to new media in the White House briefing room. This is quite a transformation to witness, especially for those like me and my guest today, Cody Akavi, who has lived and worked through the last 2 decades of traditional media domination. So we're going to talk about the breathtaking changes we are seeing in journalism and media today and what it means for the culture, politics, and even foreign policy. So welcome to the show, Cody.
Kelly, thank you very, very much for having me. I've long looked forward to being on a program with you and for us to have a conversation because we work across from each other in the office and we often talk a lot to one another. So this is a great format.
Absolutely. And I wanted to introduce you more formally. I'm sorry about that, but Cody is a senior video producer at the Quincy Institute and my colleague, and an award-winning journalist with experience in international broadcast news and current affairs. Previously, he was the head of video for Al Monitor, and before that, covered the White House for Al Jazeera English. He got his master's from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. So he's been in the mix, steeped in both the mainstream media, but also international media, and coming from organizations like Al Jazeera, who, you know, particularly after 9/11 and the wars in the Middle East, had sort of been like the bad boy of domestic media here in Washington. So you've gotten a really nice perspective of being on the inside, outside, and in between in the media. So I'm really excited to get your views on everything that I just talked about. I guess let's start with a pretty broad question. I mean, looking at the state of things today, like, what is like the wildest, most radical change you've seen in the status quo regarding the legacy media? For me, it's like the total vanishing of this idealized picture of the White House briefing room and like this sort of like West Wing television show version of like how Washington press and the White House interact. You know, the vanishing of the traditional gatekeepers who usually got to say who is in and who's out. But like, what are you seeing today, and what's like really blowing your mind?
I mean, you know, as you asked the question, you know, the first thing that came to mind to me was working in traditional media, and in particular in broadcast or doing programs. There's one person who's sitting at a desk chirping away and asking smart questions of somebody, and behind the scenes, there are a lot of people moving pulleys, making this whole system work. A place like CNN or even Al Jazeera or any of the large networks have a lot of people behind the scenes trying to produce a program. And there's a lot of focus on that. And one of the biggest and most shocking things to me was to witness that somebody who is operating out of their basement or their log cabin or their living room could produce a program on a digital streaming service and reach more people. Now, if I was a news boss, a senior vice president sitting in these boardrooms and making a lot of money, I would sweat profusely because the very raison d'etre of CNN is to get viewers. And if somebody is crushing me on those numbers and their costs are a penny in a bucket and mine are through the roof, I don't have long to live and I'm going to walk the plank. And that's like part of how media works. That has a lot to do with the technical changes and technology and how it has affected media. And that's one standard that you're always seeing. And when you started this conversation, you discussed that, how we're seeing the slow shift away from legacy media. And it's because of that. On another level, you talked about the briefing room as the central place by which you have this relationship between the White House and media, and national media engages with the White House. I've had the experience of being a White House producer for an international network in that space. And I observed that it's not an oppositional, at the time it was not an oppositional space. There actually is a relationship between like the elite media networks and the White House in terms of how you dole out information, how you receive access to information, White House travel, and so on and so forth. But these are traditions. And, we've witnessed with the emergence of other media coming into the space, Donald Trump's communications team was inviting people who are not traditional elite media networks into the briefing room. Wow. It's pretty explosive. And it shows that, the power that, for example, some networks might have is quite arbitrary. And if it doesn't serve the interests of the particular executive and how they're trying to send out their message,
that's right.
There you go.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like high school. And from the perspective of somebody myself who was never like in the in crowd or the in clique, it's kind of a little bit of schadenfreude to see like the popular kids being sidelined by the geeks and the freaks, so to speak. And that's what's happening in the briefing room. Like they're literally reshuffling the seat assignments. I don't know if it's been formalized yet, but there's been a lot of talk about that. And for anybody who doesn't know, and no reason why you shouldn't, unless you're sort of like a Washington press nerd and you've been following this, is that, the legacy media, AP, New York Times, Washington Post, all have front row seats in the briefing room, and they get preference for asking questions. And from what I was reading this morning in one of the items about this is that they spend a lot of time asking really banal, repetitive questions, so that by the time the spokesperson, the White House spokesperson, can get to anyone else, it's usually too late. And so these popular kids suck up all the air and energy and time in the briefings if it's for the Biden administration or, the preferable administration, which would be a Democrat. They would be asking inane questions or just repeating themselves and trying to get into sort of like maybe a little bit of a political gotcha situation. But these aren't questions that are going to elicit, information or illuminate issues for the American people. It's all like an insider game. And then for Trump and more adversarial administrations, it's pure gotcha.
Correct.
And that's all going up in the air and getting shuffled around now. And so it's hard for me to feel bad for these people when they're losing their seats, at the front of the room.
Hey, look, I'd say, traditionally, when I walked into the briefing room, I didn't understand this, but like AP gets the first question. Always has, always will. And traditionally, the spokesperson for the White House would have to be excused by the AP reporter. So you would observe in previous administrations, AP gets the first question, and when the spokesperson wanted to leave the briefing room because they had other things to do, they'd start to close the binder, and then the AP reporter would say, "Thank you for your time." Now, this is part of tradition, right? And in the front row, you also have the major network heads, right?
Yes.
So to your point, there's a lot of performance. You know, if I'm a CNN reporter and I want to have a big rhetorical question, it's not even a gotcha. It's just to elicit a reaction. I'll sit back there and I'll wait for the camera to come to me and I'll go, but is it fair for the American people? And, you know, it's very, very performance oriented. So that's the front row. Behind that, you have other seat assignments. Also, it's like high school, to your point. Everybody has a seat assignment. When I was there, the entire Japanese press had the back seat, back row. As Al Jazeera, we did not have a seat. You have to buy one, right? But you know, we were at the time, it was the Obama administration, and we kind of moved in. And I got the sense that, you know, from the shift, there was a big shift from the Bush administration to the Obama administration in terms of how willing they were to communicate with international media like Al Jazeera English, right? In the past, it was viewed, well, when I first joined Al Jazeera, I had a colleague who was, had been in American news for over 20 years. He goes, "Cody, when I started working here, they said it's a resume killer." And I was like, oh dear, you know, how am I going to make inroads in Washington? How am I going to have a career here?
That was like me working for Fox News, by the way. Same thing. And it kind of was a resume killer. That's another show.
That's another show.
For another episode.
I'm sure both networks have, we can do entire programs on each specific network and their evolutions and devolutions. But, you know, during the Obama administration, they were more amenable to Al Jazeera stepping in. And it wasn't because I was a nice producer. It's because Al Jazeera is owned in part, is owned by Qatar. And the Obama administration wanted to have a different relationship to the Arab world. You know, Obama went to Cairo. Obama had issues in Afghanistan. I also recall one time being on a Chamber of Commerce rooftop with my reporter at the time doing live shots, and she received a telephone call from the National Security Council spokesperson wondering how they could massage what she was saying, because Al Jazeera was the most widely watched English language program in Afghanistan. And at the time, the Obama administration had some very difficult decisions to make about whether to do a troop surge or not, which they did for all reasons. So it just shows that there's a relationship. And, you know, if you're Obama, you're going to cultivate the news organizations that you need and the news voices that serve your interests. And if you're Donald Trump, you're going to cultivate the news sources and organizations and voices that are going to project your message. So this idea of an altar where there's objective journalism, you know, and CNN and AP and everybody is doing a great job for the American people, it's a nice story, but it's not the way it works. The process is more transactional, has to do with money. And, you know, we have an executive now who is not fond of elite traditional media, has felt, you know, like he's been on the receiving end of unfair coverage from the New York Times. You see, you know, ABC, CBS. I think a lot of these organizations are kind of having challenges in terms of how they cover this person. Trump is looking at a different media landscape, and it's digital. And it's a lot different than what the legacy media brought to the table. So we're seeing that disruption, to your point.
Well, you know, I feel like Trump didn't cause this transformation.
Not at all.
I think he benefits from it. And you mentioned the guy in the basement that's able to produce the podcast versus this expensive legacy media operation. But, you know, people aren't shifting to the podcaster in the basement because it's cheaper. They're shifting because he or she is giving them better content. Can you talk a little bit to how the legacy media let the American people down, or at least have appealed to much fewer Americans? Like they have been bleeding audience because of content. And how did that evolution happen? And when?
So you're asking, like, it's not just technology that is having people move to streaming and digital, but there's something about what these people, regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum, they could be towards the right, they could be towards the left, whatever it is, they're not in the center of Rome, so to speak. They're on the fringes, but they're offering perspectives and views that I think reflect the broad spectrum of views of, let's call it, the American public right now.
Yeah.
And once upon a time, the US media, the traditional outlets, ostensibly did that. They provided that perspective. So I get the feeling if audiences are moving towards these other perspectives, these folks in the basement and other places, not in big studios, they don't really believe what these legacy media stars of screen are telling them.
Yeah.
There's a credibility issue and there's a credibility gap. Now, a lot of legacy media, that's how you exist, your credibility. You know, like if I don't trust you anymore, I'm going to turn you off. And you mentioned at the beginning that, you know, broadcast cable news, people aren't watching it. People will watch broadcast cable news for rolling coverage. If something is happening, television news is the best way to understand what's happening moment to moment, like an election.
Yeah.
But do you want afterwards, the aftermath, to have an entire panel of 12 people who express a series of views that in no way, shape, or form align with your reality? I think that if you turn on the television these days, a lot of Americans are like, I don't get that. That doesn't compute for me. But what somebody is saying on a podcast about, you know, the price of the trade-off over community issues versus militarism, that's going to get a lot more ears. CNN's not going to run that, you know, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
So you have fusion of interests, and I don't think legacy media is doing a good enough job of providing information to the American public, and it's lost credibility in that regard.
And I see, it trying not to get too partisan here, but in the realm of newspapers, let's take the Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, and the New York Times. I feel like they got very comfortable in this idea that they were reflecting liberal value, the liberal values, the liberal left values of the American people, but they took it for granted that most people thought the way that they did, but they were even disconnected in many ways to the party and the people that they thought that they were representing. And I say that specifically looking at the election. Many people have been doing these autopsies of what happened in the election. And with the Democrats, they realized that they had just lost touch with the people, meaning the people who in the past had, supported labor unions and supported working class people and middle class people and pocketbook issues like healthcare and saving for college and paying attention to how people have been, particularly boomers, are now, going into nursing homes, and their kids are paying for that, or trying to take care of their elders, and like all of these meat and potato issues. Instead, these papers were worried about identity politics and the culture wars. And whether you agree with the underlying fundamentals and the values behind those social justice issues, they still weren't speaking to the broad base of the liberal left. And when Trump won, they were sort of like left thinking, oh, how far disconnected did we become, that we weren't even representing our own audience anymore, or the audience we thought we had.
I think I read a headline somewhere fairly recently that's, explained that in polling, Americans, I think whether they're right or left, I think this, I might be mistaken, but that Democrats cared about all of those issues, but they cared about economic issues more. And that was kind of missing. I would say that when it comes to the news media, as you were talking about this, I always talk about a New York-based columnist from the past named Jimmy Breslin, who spoke in a very colloquial style and
Yep.
was very in your face. Now, the way Jimmy Breslin lived, according to his narrative, that is that, he would go to the bar in Bay Ridge or in Brooklyn or wherever, and he would come into contact with the sanitation worker, the mafia, the mailman, the school teacher, the local fire chief. These are the members of your community who provide you with the wide perspective of views.
Right.
I don't think that the columnists of the New York Times today have that wide of a spectrum of people they speak to, because they don't speak for the city the way Jimmy Breslin did. If anything, you're seeing more specified topics. Columnists are like culture specific or politics specific. I'd also point out, I know in the aftermath of the 2016 election, the New York Times expanded its perspectives of columnists because it felt like it didn't capture the totality of what was going on. And I still think they got it wrong because, but that's another, for me, the New York Times.
Well, I mean, one of the issues that I've always had was that this idea that we need to have diverse newsrooms. I totally agree, but the diversity is on this superficial level of color and ethnicity and not necessarily background. And so you don't have people coming from working class backgrounds, even middle class backgrounds in many ways. A lot of these kids, and no offense to your alma mater or Columbia, but a lot of the up and coming writers in these newsrooms are coming from elite schools, elite journalism schools. And they followed a particular path. Now, their skin color might be different, but they follow a particular professional path. I myself come from a working class background, and I've been in Washington for 25 years now. I can count on the number of fingers on my hands how many people from similar backgrounds that I've worked with in media organizations in the last 25 years. And I'm not saying that gratuitously. This is a problem. So when the face of your newsroom is all elite, you're going to get that in the writing and the coverage and the choice of topics that you're covering. And then when you do write about the people, it's not in a Jimmy Breslin style. It's more in a patronizing, condescending tone, because frankly, these people don't know what those people look like and how they talk. They take it for granted, or after 216, they go, oh, we're going to find out what the left behind has to say. And then they all took planes down to Alabama or Mississippi or the Rust Belt, and then found the most downtrodden people to talk to, and all patted themselves on the back because they went and interviewed people who were down and out or had drug problems or in the unemployment lines. And then they packed up and went home. And I feel like we need more Jimmy Breslins. And this is one of the reasons why people have tuned out to what they have to say.
True. I mean, that's a function. That's journalism, right? I mean, yeah, it's like, hey, let's go somewhere and reinforce like our previously conceived view by finding three people to then say, oh, it's a trend. Look, you see?
Yeah.
Journalism and the practice of journalism is very different than the news business. And I think that that's one of the other issues too. If people look at journalism and news in a fact-finding manner, in the sense that like, oh, events together causally lead to outcomes. If you're thinking about events in a different way, you're going to have a wider view and you're going to bring a broader perspective of views to your story. And that's necessary for people. But again, you talk about the New York Times, I always joke, like when I was at Columbia Journalism School, the New York Times was described by one professor as the lingua franca paper of our time. You don't have to like it. You don't have to love it, but you got to read it to understand the pulse of where America is. You would say that about the Wall Street Journal. I'd get that to understand where the pulse of business-oriented people who care more about Wall Street. And so it had a value. Then I read something in which somebody said, oh God, the New York Times is the values-based headline with its silly verb. The Financial Times, which is the pink paper, I think it publishes out of Europe, is an interest-based paper. The headlines just tell you what interests people have. Interests and values are very different. And I think that news media in the United States, because it tends to be pretty personality-based,
Yeah.
to lean hard on like values-oriented ideas instead of just telling you the news and why somebody from one perspective would think one thing and why somebody from another perspective would think another thing. Instead, it kind of subtly says this perspective is unacceptable, but this one is.
Yes, yes.
And if you talk in this way about the issues in this regard, we're okay with it. As soon as you jump, out of that acceptable term of discourse, then you're over here.
Yeah.
I don't see the world that way. I would also point out, like, I lived through 9/11. I lived through this bizarre era of news media where everybody tried to tell us that the world had changed forever. And I'd lived in the world because I had a pretty peripatetic childhood. So I knew that that wasn't right. And lo and behold, like a lot of the projected stories that these elite media, the establishment told us proved to be wrong. And Kelly, to go back to that kind of central point about why we've moved away from legacy media, it's not just technology. The media lost credibility on issues of war and peace.
Yep.
They didn't do their job. And whether they want to like apologize for it, pretend it didn't matter, say that they got, oh, they were, fooled too by George Bush and company. None of that's true. Like, you lost credibility, and that's a slow decline. You have to have credibility. And that's the most important thing for all of these news organizations. I would say the same thing holds true for anybody who's operating out of their basement. You should be a critical thinker too. And maybe that's where journalism has moved. Journalism doesn't have to be, some cloak that people wear and say, I am a journalist. I believe journalism is an act. So whether you do it at the Baltimore Sun, at the homeless vendor program paper down the street, whether you do it at the hollowed halls of the New York Times or in the lofty shade of palaces in the United Arab Emirates, just pursue that. And
yeah,
that's one thing that the media has completely lost in legacy land. I don't see it. Credibility is something that loses. It's very hard to get it back.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the issue with national security, issues of war and peace, particularly after 9/11, was that the corporate media was getting fatter and it was getting less diverse. Like we had 5 conglomerates owning, the majority of news media. They do not care about the truth. All they care about is getting the story, getting the access. And so you had all of these top mainstream network reporters who were embedded, throughout the wars, who were in the front row at the briefing room. And the most important thing was the access. And many of these reporters have no experience covering war. So they were happy just to take what the Pentagon was saying and what the White House was saying, with no skepticism whatsoever, and then internalized it. And so they believed this is how this works. This is what we need to do. And if anybody criticized them, that somehow they were not of the body, that they were somehow outside of the realm, off the reservation. You're against us. You're not with us. You're against us. Yes. And they believed that they started drinking in the Kool-Aid and then sharing it with each other. And so that's what and I don't think it's ever really changed, Cody. You see how they covered the Ukraine war, for example, even Israel, Gaza. It's very conventional. It's very within the lines. And anybody who sort of who criticizes that are somehow off the reservation and not part of the sort of the same club. And I think that that's being tested now. What we're seeing is the ultimate test. And people are saying, no, we're not buying it. And furthermore, we're not going to watch you anymore. We're not going to listen to you anymore. we don't regard you as the authority
Mhm.
that we did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I think that's the real transformation we're seeing, is that people have just turned the dial, like, to use an old time
Yeah,
cliche.
it's a channel. Like, if I don't like what I see, I'm going to flip the channel,
Yeah,
and nothing you're going to do about that. News is information. News is entertainment as well. News is relevance. News is credibility. You need to appeal to your audience. I think the other thing that's happening here is that legacy media doesn't know what its audience is. Once
right,
upon a time,
right.
we had a very, very wide audience. 40 years ago, you had 3 major networks. Walter Cronkite, so 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, would speak to the nation. There is one other thing I was going to say. There's an imagined community. There's this concept that, the newspaper fulfills this for us. If you and I live across town and we don't know one another and we get the same newspaper every day, you and I both read about the geriatric luau. We also read about the fire, at the school. So
Yep.
even though I don't know you, I know that you're a member of the community. I feel like I'm a part of this. We share something
Right.
in terms of our interests. Television did that, right? When Walter
Mm-hmm.
Cronkite would step up and speak to the American
Mm-hmm.
people about like the death of the president. I recall like seeing the Watergate footage where you had White House press reporters crying. There was this idea that something impure has happened, something that has stained the sanctity of this relationship. We're trying to present the American people with information. And then as you continue, the American people starts to become fractured, right? For a variety of reasons. I want to appeal to people who are more aggressive about this. I want to appeal to people who are more working class and want this. I want people. So now you have all of these little demographies of people
Yep.
who appeal to your specific message. And lo and behold, your imagined community is changing. I'm not saying it's going away. It's fragmenting. It's changing. In this realm, see a lot of opportunity for realignment of ideas and views, right? So if I were to be like a new media czar, but if I wanted to create an empire of media, I would try to figure out how you take all of these fragmented communities and create news that appeals to all of them for a variety of different reasons. But that's a challenging that's a challenging effort. It might not make as much money as CNN bosses want to make, but that's kind of the way things are going. Diffusion of media. At the same time, you have consolidation of media.
Right.
And that consolidation of media on the elites is not translating necessarily into gains for journalism.
No.
So we're very, very,
all.
We have a confused, imagined community, if you will.
Well, listen, we've run out of time. I want to thank you so much. I hope you'll come on the show again, because I don't think we even scratched the surface of this issue, and we could talk about more granular or current events involving the media. I would love to have you on. You are obviously very well-versed, both in your own experience, but just being as a consumer of the news yourself. And so I appreciate your insights on this.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on the show to talk about this stuff. This is our bag. This is what.
Yep.
This is what we love talking about. Thank you so much.
Okay, we'll be talking to you again.
Thank you, Kelly.